Welcome to episode 63 of the Energy Balance Podcast, where we teach you how to live without constant hunger and cravings, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, and other low energy symptoms by maximizing your cellular energy. I'm Jay Feldman. I'm a health coach and independent health researcher. And joining me again today is my good friend Mike Fave. Mike and I have been studying health and nutrition together for a long time now, and Mike also draws on his experiences from working within the healthcare industry. Today's episode is the first part of a series discussing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and in this series we're going to begin by explaining some of the general mechanisms and physiology pertaining to this disease, this condition, and these general mechanisms, this physiology, pretty directly applies and correlates to virtually every other chronic health issue and so many of the issues that we talk about. So it's really helpful to understand these concepts, and we are going to try to simplify the physiology with some graphics. So if you would like to see those, then you might want to watch this episode or this series on YouTube, but we will also make sure to explain verbally as well. And then toward the end of the series, we'll go on to discuss what all of this means in terms of diet and lifestyle and supplements that you can use to reverse this condition and various others that are caused by these same mechanisms. So in today's episode in particular, we'll be discussing why fructose does not cause fatty liver. We'll be talking about the three major problems with the research that suggests that fructose does cause fatty liver. We'll be talking about how fat production in the liver can actually be protective. We'll be talking about the role of PUFA and endotoxin in de novo lipogenesis, which is fat production, and inflammation. And then we'll be talking about why overeating is not the cause of fatty liver. To check out these show notes for today's episode, you can head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at these studies and articles and anything else that we mention throughout today's episode. And this series was inspired by some listener questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer on a future Q&A episode, you can send those in to jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com, and that's jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to leave those questions in the comments. And if you are dealing with any of these symptoms of fatty liver disease, or if you have fatty liver disease, or if you're dealing with insulin resistance or any other related conditions like diabetes or heart disease, or if you're dealing with any low energy symptoms, maybe that's chronic cravings and hunger, or fatigue, or joint pain, or weight gain, or digestive symptoms like bloating, or inflammation, or troubles with gut motility, or maybe you're dealing with brain fog, or poor sleep, or hormonal imbalances, whether those are reproductive related or low libido, or if you're dealing with, again, any other chronic health conditions, maybe those are autoimmune issues, then head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for a free energy balance mini course, where I'll explain how these different symptoms and conditions are really caused by a lack of energy. And I'll also walk you through the main things that you can do from a diet and lifestyle perspective to maximize your cellular energy and therefore resolve these symptoms and conditions. So to sign up for that free energy balance mini course, head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy. And with that, let's get started. All right. So I've gotten a good couple of questions about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which alone makes it, worth digging into. But also the mechanisms here are things that we talk about all the time in terms of other disease processes, and we'll talk about why that is, because basically this process is associated with virtually any other metabolic issue. So it's entirely relevant in that way. And then also we'll be diving into some of the mechanisms here that help to elucidate things that are also happening not only in the liver, but elsewhere in the body when metabolism's off, and when, if someone's concerned about gaining body fat, or if they're concerned about really any other issue that results from a lack of energy. I mean, this is much like all the other diseases that we look into. This is basically just looking at that same disease process, but isolated into what's going on at the liver, or somebody who is extremely susceptible to something going on at the liver, and then that leading to this disease pathology in that location. So with that in mind, just those couple of questions that we got. Deb had asked about a podcast on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and whether it can be reversed with diet. And then Kathleen had asked about choline and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in general. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll talk about choline a little bit later on. But again, just as an introduction here, this process of fatty liver is extraordinarily common. As much as, I mean, some of the figures are as high as 1/3 of the US population that has fatty liver disease, which is just an insane figure. And that's 1 out of every 3 people, over 30%. And it's very strongly associated with, as I mentioned, virtually any other metabolic issue, whether that's just insulin resistance and diabetes directly, or heart disease, or really any of the other conditions and problems that we talk about all the time. And so with that in mind, I mean, for one, we'll discuss basically one place to start is I guess what exactly does non-alcoholic fatty liver disease look like? And on the front, basically on the surface, it looks exactly like it sounds, which is that the liver is accumulating fat. It's becoming very fatty. It's producing a lot of fat, and there's a lot of fat accumulating there. And along with that, you'll tend to see elevated liver enzymes on blood work. You also potentially see elevated lipids
and triglycerides.
Yeah, specifically triglycerides. Yeah. And as I mentioned, it's associated with so many other conditions. Is there anything else you want to add there, Mike? I mean, I know you've probably seen this quite a few times clinically in the hospitals.
I think that while it can show with elevated triglycerides and elevated cholesterol and elevated liver enzymes, that's not always the case. I think a lot of people have like a silent deal where their panel looks fine.
Mm-hmm.
Their lipid panel may look fine. Their cholesterol and their triglycerides may only be mildly elevated, but they actually have fatty liver. So like the best way to really determine is through some type of imaging, whether that's an ultrasound or, I mean, I don't recommend a CT scan, but a CT or an MRI is really, with an ultrasound, are really the ways that you're going to be able to see if you have fatty liver or not. And then like, because the elevated liver enzymes or like higher triglycerides, like those don't necessarily mean fatty liver. Like the elevated liver enzymes, could you have some type of damage to the liver from a supplement or something that you took, or a medication or whatever that is. And then like the triglycerides and a lot of high carb diets, triglycerides can go up, and that may not necessarily be because the liver is fatty. So it's kind of, you have to, the real way to know is going to be that ultrasound. That's probably what the doctor is going to recommend first, because it's like the least expensive, least invasive option. So yeah, that's like the gold standard to be able to tell. And the other thing I want to point out is that fatty liver is a new disease in terms of the scheme of humanity, as far as like the medical establishment recognizing it. So like in the early part of the 19th century, there was no fatty liver. It became more prevalent towards I think it appeared around the 1950s, if I remember correctly. And then it just started like increasing drastically from like the 70s and up. And now we're at a point where like 1/3 of the population is dealing with fatty liver. And a lot of people want to, well, I guess we'll get into that later. But yeah, this is a newer disease, just like cancer is a newer disease, just like all this heart disease and these autoimmune diseases are all newer diseases. So it's moving in trend with basically everything else that's going on. But it was relatively unheard of in the early part of the 19th century.
20th century.
20th, yeah. The 1900s.
And it's important, as you mentioned, to point out that those markers that are looked at on the labs, the triglycerides and liver enzymes, are symptoms. And so they are symptoms that you tend to see with fatty liver. But as you mentioned, that's not always very tightly correlated, and they can be elevated without fatty liver. And then you can also have fatty liver without those elevations. So yeah, that's worth clarifying. And I also wanted to clarify, normally when we're talking about fatty liver, it's separated between alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Yeah.
And in reality, I mean, the reason for that tends to be because they're saying it's caused specifically by alcohol, and there's a different approach as far as the treatment, which is just you have to drink less alcohol, more or less. And so, but it's worth noting that the physiology there is not too different. Basically, the exact same thing's happening. It's just they're pointing out that in one case it's caused by alcohol, in the other case they say, oh, well, we don't really know. But we'll talk about really how the mechanisms are virtually the same. It's just a question of what's causing it. And there really shouldn't be any separation. As far as like the actual disease process goes, it's the same virtually. Did you want to add anything in there?
Just that alcoholic fatty liver disease has been around. It's the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that became like a more of a big deal because it's traditionally known to be caused by alcohol at the fatty liver. And then when they started seeing people pay, I think at first, if I remember correctly, like they started seeing people with fatty liver disease and they would ask them if they drink alcohol and they would say no. And the doctor kind of wouldn't believe them. And then eventually they realized that no, people are actually getting a fatty liver and it had nothing to do with them drinking alcohol. They weren't drinking at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, so the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the newer disease. Alcoholic fatty liver disease has been known for quite some time.
Right. Yeah. And I do want to mention also, I've seen clients with severe fatty livers that have been diagnosed via scans. And I've also seen clients with elevated liver enzymes. And honestly, as far as these disease processes go, it's not all that difficult to improve. I mean, it's a lot of the same things we talk about, and we'll talk about the details, but these are not genetic problems that you're just stuck with. These are not, I mean, it takes a lot to lead to this, really extreme fatty liver situation. And I've seen people who have had severe fatty liver on a prior scan, and then the next scan, it's completely gone. Same thing with the liver enzymes, like very highly elevated, several times above the range, and then right in range, not too long after. So it's definitely something that is pathological. And what I mean is that it's not just random, it's not just genetic. There's absolutely metabolic reasons that lead to it, and therefore a lot of things that we can do. And with that in mind, that's why we're going to spend some time talking through the mechanisms and what's going on there prior to talking about what to actually do, because that exact, it illustrates exactly why this is so clearly just a metabolic issue.
Yeah. And I've seen quite a few people with fatty liver that weren't gluttonous in terms of how much they're eating. And I mean, that even included my dad. Like when he was diagnosed with fatty liver, and when I looked at his caloric intake on a regular basis, like it was less than 2,000 calories. He's about 5'10", 165, 170 pounds. So, and he's not fat at all. Like he's not visibly fat. Like there's no obesity, there's nothing like that going on. But when they scanned him, he had a fatty liver, and he didn't have elevated triglycerides. He didn't have elevated cholesterol. He had slightly elevated liver enzymes. And I think it was only his ALT. So that's why I was saying it's, depends on the individual. And a lot of people try and break down fatty liver. Like, and I've seen this quite a lot, and it kind of annoys me, where it's like, oh, it's gluttony. It's like, oh, you're eating too much. You're eating you're eating too much sugar, too much fat. And that's why your liver's fat. And I have some other relatives who that was the case, right? And that they had severely elevated triglycerides, and they were kind of just binging on food in general. And then they got diagnosed by a scan with fatty liver. So there can be multiple causes as far as like a lifestyle effect in fatty liver, but the pathologies tend to converge in the same direction. So you can have somebody who's completely like binging on tons of food, and the family members that are doing this were like eating lots of candy, and lots of just junk food, tons and tons of junk food.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas my dad is somebody who's, severely undereating chronically for an extended period of time, showing with fatty liver for years. And
yeah,
I mean, he didn't make any changes to his lifestyle, which is why he continues to, or he continued at that point to show the fatty liver. So I think it's important to realize that it's not just a disease of gluttony. Like diabetes isn't just a disease of gluttony, or obesity isn't just a disease of gluttony. There's more going on to the situation, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we'll even be talking about the opposite, the potential role of fasting in lipid fat accumulation and fatty liver. Yeah. Not that I think that's the common cause either necessarily, but yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And we've talked about that quite a bit. I'll link back to those weight loss episodes we discussed where, again, I think it's so terrible how the assumption is just that if you're overweight, if you've got fatty liver, diabetes, you're just overeating, you are just gluttonous, you're just weak, weak-willed, and all you have to do is try harder. And if you say you're not eating a lot, you're obviously lying or just doing a bad job of keeping an eye on what you're eating, because that's the only thing that can cause these situations. And yeah, that's not only far from the truth, in some ways it's the opposite, where you tend to see the opposite relationship between low energy and low food intake and obesity. And that's because of this extremely poor conversion from food to energy. But sometimes you do see overeating. But again, that overeating is not caused by being weak, weak-willed. The reason is because, again, when that process is not functioning well, you then become hungrier than you would have been before because you don't have as much energy, even though you're eating the same amount or even more of food. And that leads to that vicious cycle. So
you literally have an energy deficit. In a lot of these states, it's
yeah.
like a cellular energy deficit despite a supposed caloric excess.
Right. Exactly. So I'll link back to those episodes. We've had quite a few of those talking through those situations, but a lot of parallels here. So with that in mind, let's discuss some of the basics of what's going on in fatty liver. Basically, what we're seeing is an accumulation of fat at the liver. And to keep that really basic, you basically have more fat production, or just, absorption or fat uptake versus the fat that's being removed or cleared from the liver. And that's the basics of it, but there's a lot of things that affect both sides of that equation that are worth considering. So we'll start on the fat production side because that's normally where people are focusing. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions here. And one of the main ones we'll talk about is fructose being the cause of this excess fat production. So that's kind of the main areas. Basically, you've got two pathways for fat production. You've got what's called de novo lipogenesis, which is the production of fat from carbohydrates. And de novo means new. So you're creating new fat. Lipogenesis is just the production of fat. And then you've just got regular lipogenesis, which is basically taking fats or components of fats like the fatty acids and the glycerols and putting them together into triglycerides, into fats. And it's not coming from carbohydrate. Instead, it's coming from fat, basically. Those are the two main areas that we're getting, that we're producing fat from. Now, this is not the main pathway for either of those substrates. It's not like your liver just gets some glucose or fructose and it just converts it right to fat. And it's not like the liver just gets some fat, some fatty acids and just converts them right to fat. That tends to be really the last ditch option when the other options that are ideal are not able to be carried out for various reasons that we'll discuss. So generally when it comes to carbohydrates, we'll start there. There are a couple places that are preferred for carbohydrates to go. One is just to be oxidized directly as a fuel. So, fuel going into an engine and being burned for energy. That's one of the first places. The other thing is that the liver is one of our major storage organs for
glycogen.
Yeah, for glycogen and basically for fuel for the brain in that way, because our brain is our main consumer of glucose, or one of the main, depending on how much you use your muscles at a high intensity. And so our brain is one of our main producers of energy, or users of glucose, but it can't store any glucose as glycogen. So instead, basically, the liver is the brain's storage organ for glycogen, as well as the rest of the body too. But for the most part, actually, the liver and brain are the main ones that are using at least a decent amount of that glucose. And kidneys as well.
Besides the muscles, because the muscles have their own sink of glycogen.
Mm-hmm. Which can be replenished by the liver, in certain ways. But they store their own glycogen there. And again, they're only using that for more intense activity.
Yep.
So we've got the carbohydrates being oxidized, or in the liver, they're often stored as glycogen. The glucose is converted to glycogen to be stored. And then one of the other main pathways is that the liver will either convert that glucose to other carbohydrates or just convert the fructose to other carbohydrates. Yep. Including glucose. So, and I guess I should have mentioned this to start, but the reason why people are concerned about fructose in the liver is because when we consume glucose, it goes right into the bloodstream and you see, a blood sugar spike. When we consume fructose, in combination with glucose or not, if it gets absorbed, it goes through the liver first. So the liver is the first, it's like the first area that determines what happens to the fructose.
Yeah. It's like the regulator.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that it does quite often is it'll convert that fructose right to glucose and then send it back out so that it can be distributed to the rest of the body, including to the brain. So those are basically the main things that will happen, and they'll happen to a much greater extent than the fructose will just be converted to fat. As I mentioned, that conversion to fat is really a last ditch option when those other pathways can't be used or carried out. So with that in mind, let's dig in a little bit to the details as far as what does happen when we're consuming fructose. What are some of the misconceptions here? And we've talked about some of these as far as this idea that fructose just directly causes body fat accumulation or hepatic fat accumulation, liver fat accumulation. So let's breeze through those, and then we'll talk about some of the details of what actually happens with fructose at the liver.
Before we get there, I just want to, so just to clarify what you're saying, there's three possible routes for fructose to go to a large extent. It's converted into something else like glucose or lactate. It's stored as liver glycogen, or it goes through de novo lipogenesis, where it creates new fats in the liver. That last pathway, de novo lipogenesis, in humans is very low from fructose specifically. And under normal considerations, right? If you're taking the fructose, and we'll get to this, if you're taking the fructose in combination with glucose, and especially if it's in the form of fruit, that de novo lipogenesis pathway is very small compared or relative to the other two pathways where it's converted to glycogen, or it's basically converted into lactate or glucose and sent out to be oxidized by the tissues of the body. So I think that's just to like make that very clear. De novo lipogenesis, especially from fructose in that context, is very, very minimal.
Yep.
Yeah, that's because that's essentially what you're getting at. That it's just it's so, because a lot of people, the idea, and I think this was promoted by Dr. Lustig with his whole anti-fructose crusade, was essentially that fructose goes to the liver, and just like alcohol goes to the liver, it's like people, like, they've conflated these two things. So alcohol goes to the liver and has to be detoxified, and fructose has to be processed by the liver, so then it must be a toxin, which is logical fallacy, complete. That doesn't make any sense, especially when you compare the metabolic pathways. But it doesn't just convert straight to fat and make you fat. I mean, if that was the case, and these is n equals 2, both you and I would be severely overweight. And I think both of us have maintained our weight within relative range for years, consuming ample amounts of fructose. It's just the source is from fruit. So I just want to put that out there. That's a very common misconception. And the de novo lipogenesis from fructose, from fruit in particular, is very low.
Yeah, and we'll look at those studies in a moment, but so a lot of the people in the paleosphere, the ketosphere, the low carb sphere, the carnivore sphere will discuss how fructose is just going to be, it's going to be taken up by the liver, converted right to fats. And as you mentioned, Robert Lustig was one of the main ones who promoted that. And when you look at the pathways that he describes, and he's like, this is what happens when you take in fructose, it is something that can happen, but it's all the pathways that we're going to talk about that are the last ditch pathways when it's not being used properly. And he looks at these rat studies that show that this is what's happening with the fructose, but there are so many confounding factors there that we'll discuss in a moment that basically prevent us from, it prevents you from extrapolating that to eating fructose actually in your diet. It's really not the same situation because of these other confounding variables that force the fructose into these inflammatory fat-producing pathways, which it really should not be doing in a healthy liver with a healthy fructose source in a human. So let's talk about that now, unless you want to add anything first.
Yeah, and the only thing is, Lustig, I think, does have a couple, I think there's one human study he did with children, but there was just a blanket recommendation to eliminate fructose foods, which is
like soda.
Exactly, which in the human, in modern human diet, particularly in the United States, the most common fructose foods, especially foods that kids are eating, is like Gushers and fruit roll-ups and cookies with like cane sugar, or not even like high fructose corn syrup. And so it's not like they're telling a bunch of kids, oh, you need to stop drinking so much orange juice. The recommendation was, you need to stop eating so much just straight up garbage, which is, and that's a completely different argument than, oh, you're eating too many kiwis. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. And instead of narrowing it down to fructose, that needs to be put into context of where the fructose is coming from, because there's not a single fruit study. There's not a single study with fruit or fruit juice, 100% fruit juice, that shows severe metabolic derangements or metabolic derangements in general. If any of them, if any of the studies, if anything, most of the studies show no effect, or they show beneficial effect. So it's like, it has to be put into context. You can't just, fructose bad, especially when they're drawing conclusions from rat studies. And then the extension is, we're going to move into children, or we're going to move into humans, and we're going to say, okay, you need to have a low fructose diet. And they're going to replace, they're going to replace their chocolate chip cookies and their Gushers and fruit snacks and their Capri Suns with, you know, with like bread or something like that. It's like it's a very different, or potatoes. Like it's a completely, that's a very different change than just fructose versus glucose.
Mm-hmm.
So, and yeah, we can get into that right now. That's just where like a lot of it comes from. And I feel like there's a lot of conflation and logical fallacy between things, and without looking at the specifics and the nuance. And that's sort of where we're going to get at today, particularly with fructose. And that's because a lot of people immediately go to fructose as like, oh, fructose, fatty liver. Like I've even seen it on other podcasts where like I've seen some bodybuilders say, oh, well, like I had fatty liver, it must be because I was eating fruit pre-workout. It's like, I highly doubt it was because you're eating fruit pre-workout. Highly, highly doubt it.
Yeah, probably more stress hormone related, and we'll talk about why
Or
that
anabolic steroid use with different compounds, or running ketogenic diets and things like that.
Yeah. Which and yeah, probably a lot of it is mediated through the stress hormones. Yeah,
not the apple that you ate before your 20 sets of squats.
Right. Yeah. So let's dig into what's found in the research as far as these misconceptions go, and why the research showing that, hey, these rats got fructose and it caused fatty liver. Like, why is that not relevant to us and what we're actually doing as humans and what we're eating? So I'd basically say there's three main things we want to consider when looking at the research that people are citing that fructose will cause fatty liver. And we did discuss this in 2 previous episodes. So I'll link back to those, and we'll just kind of give the overview now for what's wrong with these. And then what I really want to talk about in more detail is, instead of those things, what happens when humans eat fructose containing foods, and why is it not a problem? So the 3 main things to consider, the first one is just the capacity of humans versus rats, especially in terms of our livers. And humans have a much larger brain relative to their body size than other mammals, especially rats, and use, I want to say it's like maybe 5 times, like our brains use more than about 5 times as much energy as rats do, rats' brains, like percentage wise. And then the other thing too is our livers use a huge amount of energy. They use the second most amount of energy of any organ to only the brain. And it's only about like 10% to 15% less than what the brain uses. So we've got these 2 very, very energy intensive organs compared to these rats, which really don't need to have massive livers or really well functioning livers, because they don't have a brain that they need to fuel that well. They don't have as much need to store glycogen and to use carbohydrates. So with that in mind, there's research comparing humans and rats and the livers, including enzyme production and also just other features and qualities of them. And they've basically come to the conclusion that any research looking at what's going on in a rat liver really shouldn't be extrapolated to humans at all. Like, there really can be no comparison, because they're really so different in their capacities. And what we're talking about, in some cases at least, is a capacity different, or a problem, where it's like the liver can only store so much fructose. But when you're using a rat study to elucidate that, it's really not relevant. So that's the first part. The next 2 parts, and I'll let you jump in after I just mentioned these next 2. So The next one, which is a huge one, is endotoxin. And so in most of these studies, both in rats and in humans, they'll be giving fructose on its own as opposed to with glucose. And we and rats do not absorb fructose very well when it's given on its own. It absorbs much better when it's with glucose. And in nature, we only find it with glucose. You never really find fructose alone. And even looking at the ratios, it's rare that you have a majorly high ratio of fructose to glucose. It tends to be very, very close. There are some fruits and like honey and things that might have a higher fructose to glucose ratio, but it's still not all that high. So when you take in the fructose alone, because it's not able to be absorbed very well, it ends up feeding the bacteria that are in the intestines, and those then end up producing a decent amount of endotoxin, which then blocks the liver's capacity to use the liver, or to use the fructose effectively.
To use the liver.
Yeah, it blocks the ability for the liver to use the liver. So the liver can't use the fructose very well because of the endotoxin,
or anything else.
Well, so endotoxin is the first one, right? So and that's been shown. Like, they have these studies where they found that the mediators here with the fructose causing fatty liver are things like intestinal overgrowth, intestinal permeability, and endotoxin. And then when they give antibiotics, it reverses or prevents any of those effects. So you basically see feeding of fructose that normally they're saying it causes fatty liver, but when you address these factors, it doesn't end up causing fatty liver at all, meaning that in this case, what they're showing is that it really just has to do with an endotoxin issue that's a feature of these studies, as opposed to actually being a fructose issue, where that endotoxin shouldn't be a problem in humans eating fructose from regular foods. And I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, we have the graph too, if you want to pull it up, but essentially
I'll pull that up now. Yeah.
In the fructose, since our intestine can only absorb a certain amount of fructose, and it's dependent upon the individual, but I think it's shown anywhere from 5 to 50 grams by itself. Now, when you and the reason why this is because fructose, I think it uses the GLUT5 receptor in the intestine. I think, if I remember correctly, it's GLUT5. But it uses GLUT5 receptor in the intestine to be absorbed. Now, that's by itself. If glucose is also present, then there's like a co-transport where glucose will pull in fructose together. So you can actually have, like, if you have glucose with your fructose, you'll have basically unlimited amounts of fructose that can be absorbed. Mm-hmm. So when that fructose isn't absorbed, when there's no glucose with it, and you've reached your intestinal saturation or capacity, then the bacteria have access to it, and then they can essentially produce endotoxin. And mm-hmm. The study that I was referring to, they literally, so the fructose will come in. This is the intestinal mucosa. The microbiome will gain access to it, and then it'll produce LPS, which is endotoxin. The LPS will upregulate or trigger toll-like receptor 4, which is basically an immune receptor that senses certain components of bacteria. Toll-like receptor 4 specifically senses endotoxin, which is a component of the bacterial cell wall. And just to put this in context for people, the immune cells of the body sense different components of viruses, bacteria, parasites, and they recognize those components, and then it basically triggers off an alarm system, kind of like, oh shit, there's a bacteria here. So when the body gets access, or when the immune system is exposed to toll-like receptor 4, it automatically triggers the inflammatory process. And then also TLR4 is upregulated in conditions of fibrosis and has been shown to lead to fibrosis. But so when this TLR4 is activated at the liver, it causes the liver, or endotoxin in general, but TLR4 signaling with endotoxin upregulates cytokine, and it's not on here, but it's called tumor necrosis factor alpha. And this cytokine basically causes the liver to directly upregulate fatty acid production. That's cholesterol, that's triglycerides. So why does it do this? Well, when you have, and so that's through triglycerides and de novo lipogenesis, which is right next to it there. So when you have these fatty acids, they are able to bind endotoxin, and they inhibit that endotoxin from reaching the, I think it's the Kupffer cells, which are the macrophages in the liver, because the macrophages in the liver produce or signal with more tumor necrosis factor alpha with the more endotoxin that they're exposed to. So the fatty acids will bind that endotoxin, and once it's bound to the fatty acid, the triglycerides, or the even chylomicrons from the intestine, or the lipoproteins in the blood, your HDL, your LDL, VLDL, etc. When it binds to all of those, it basically inactivates the endotoxin. So then the endotoxin reaches other cells within the liver that basically break down the fats in the endotoxin, excrete that into the bile, and it gets carried out of the digestive tract, no problem, right? And then basically that endotoxin isn't able to reach the Kupffer cells or the liver's macrophages, the liver's immune cells. So it's a negative feedback loop. It turns off the inflammatory process. But when you're chronically exposed to this endotoxin, and you're chronically upregulate your production of tumor necrosis factor alpha, and then your de novo lipogenesis and triglyceride production and cholesterol production in the liver, you are also, the tumor necrosis factor alpha also inhibits some of the oxidation of the fat in the liver. It basically causes like a metabolic derangement. So you have like you have all this production of fats and an export into the bloodstream. And then the liver, it also inhibits the liver from taking it back in, and it basically clogs up the whole system. It's a defensive mechanism, but it's called the acute phase response. And it's literally supposed to be acute. It's supposed to happen for a short period of time. when you have this chronic upregulation of it, when you have pure fructose by itself, or another example is alcohol, which basically does the same process. The alcohol itself causes damage to the intestinal mucosa, allowing endotoxin to reach the liver. And when that endotoxin reaches the liver, it basically upregulates the same process. And what you find is in germ-free mice, mice that have no intestinal microbiome, they basically, when they're exposed to fructose or to alcohol, they don't develop the fatty liver to the same extent. They definitely don't develop the hepatic fibrosis or hepatitis, the inflammation of the liver, or the cancer that eventually happens after those processes basically go on for an extended period of time. Now, if you take bacteria from mice in general and other mouse, and you put it into the intestinal environment of these germ-free mice, and then you expose them to either high concentrations of fructose or high concentrations of alcohol, you basically get fatty liver, depending on how much PUFA you have in your liver, hepatitis, then fibrosis or cirrhosis, and then liver cancer. That's kind of like the progression of how it goes. So a lot of this is mediated through endotoxin, because the endotoxin's metabolic effect on the liver, basically it like deranges the whole process, because the liver is flowing energy through, right? So you're taking in energy in your diet, and then the liver is basically, it's like an accountant to some extent, or a regulator, where it's seeing, oh, what do we have here, and then how are we going to partition it? Oh, we're going to put some of the glycogen. Oh, we're going to send some out to your muscles and your organs. Oh, we're gonna take these amino acids and use them this way. So it's kind of like that turning point, that fulcrum, where it's making the decisions on where things go and how they're going to be used, and processing them in different directions. When you take endotoxin and you throw it, imagine the liver's like an office. It's like throwing a bomb into the office. The whole office is like panics, and then they're unable to maintain the processes that they need to maintain. It's everybody's frantic in the office. So like, oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And yeah, so it deranges that whole process, and we're going to actually break that down. But yeah, that's what I think is the most important piece to look at here, is this metabolic derangement is the central piece. And then you have these mediating factors like endotoxin that causes the issue. And the other thing I want to point out that's kind of interesting is the germ-free mice that were exposed to alcohol, like the alcohol actually didn't cause such a derangement in the metabolism in them, because their livers weren't exposed to the endotoxin. They were like able to process the alcohol and then the acetaldehyde that's produced from the alcohol like relatively easily, compared to mice that had the bacteria and were exposed to endotoxin. So it was very interesting study, because it removes the sense of like alcohol is this primary toxin. It was more like the primary toxin with alcohol was endotoxin, and alcohol was kind of secondary. Like, it obviously is not a good thing, but its effects were mediated largely through endotoxin, as far as the pathology of cirrhosis and steatohepatitis and whatnot.
Yeah. And another important feature I want to highlight here is that the endotoxin, both the endotoxin itself and all of the effects of it, the like inflammatory responses, also inhibit energy production, leading to that low ATP that we're seeing. And that is what causes, and we'll get into this in a moment, in a bit. That is what causes the fructose to, instead of being converted to energy, become converted to the fats. And as you mentioned, which is huge, this is protective. This is a protective, it's meant to be a protective acute response to the endotoxin to help deal with that problem. The then problem comes about when this is, not only when this is chronic, but it's not something we want to have even ideal in the short term, or to even be happening in the short term. Of course, like, it's never something we really want to be happening much. But we do have ways to deal with it, but over time those ways come at a cost. And so this is essentially the cost. Well, fatty liver is a cost, and endotoxin is a cause that can lead to this as a cost. There are a lot of other costs to dealing with a lot of endotoxin, but this is one of them. So yeah, I think that's the main thing I wanted to mention as far as this goes. But there's another thing that you alluded to as far as PUFA goes. But is there anything else you want to add as far as this graphic?
Well, yeah, we can get to the PUFA. I just want to add here that the acute phase response wasn't necessarily like adapted to high amounts of endotoxin. It's when you have an infection in general, you upregulate the acute phase response. When somebody is septic, they'll have increases in blood lipids as a protective effect as well. So it's like, it's, while endotoxin is triggering it from the gut in lots of these cases, there's also, it's like main effects, I think initially was for infection. It's like if you have like an infection, you're going to drastically upregulate your lipoproteins to protect yourself and triglycerides. And basically in animal models, when they inhibit that process, the animals have like much higher and worse mortality without that response. So it is very protective, but again, it was supposed to help you get over the infection while your immune system clears it. So your body isn't destroyed by all this leaking of endotoxin from wherever the bacteria or whatever, what have you, is infecting you is releasing. So it's like, again, it was initially developed just for an acute response during infection. And that's why it's called the acute phase response. And then that was it. The other thing I want to point out here is that when you have the acute phase response, when you have this response, a whole host of other inflammatory mediators and systems are elevated, including like sympathetic nervous system and RAS cascade. And the RAS cascade, which we talked about in other situations, has direct negative effects on the vasculature. So when you have an acute phase response, it's kind of hard to parse out if the actual triglycerides and lipoproteins are causing the damage to the vascular bed, or is it the inflammatory system in which those lipoproteins and triglycerides are present in, inducing oxidation in them and then also damaging the vasculature and then having them deposited. It's not just, high cholesterol, the cholesterol itself is the problem. It's like, what is the environment that cholesterol is in? And looking at the acute phase response, like it's kind of hard to tell if it's actually the inflammatory state that's inducing the problem. Which, I mean, we know the inflammatory state is inducing the problem, but is that what's causing the damage from the high cholesterol itself because it's oxidizing the cholesterol, or is the high cholesterol itself a problem? And I just bring that up because in a lot of these metabolic deranged states like diabetes or obesity or fatty liver or insulin resistance, like people want to be jumped so quick and say, it's your cholesterol is high, so you're going to get heart disease from your high cholesterol. And it's like, I don't think it's the cholesterol per se. I think it's the actual state, the actual inflammatory state. And the cholesterol being the protective mechanism, directly trying to lower it doesn't, like, you want to lower it by solving the problem. You don't want to just lower cholesterol for the sake of lowering cholesterol, especially with its known protective effect. So I just want to point that one out here because there's a reason why these things are going awry, and it's not just random.
Yeah. And we talked about that. We talked about and so I'll link to those episodes talking about heart disease and cholesterol and why the lipids themselves are not the problems there. They're just symptoms that are actually a part of the defensive response. And so, as you're saying, I don't think that there's anything wrong with this defensive response. I don't think it's like one of those situations where it was meant to deal with this, but instead it's dealing with this. I mean, the situation that the problem is just that we're putting our bodies in these environments that are continuing the need for that response. Not that there's anything wrong with the response. Like, as you said, it's really helpful for something like an infection. And most of the things that we're doing now put us in a state of basically chronic infection. So it's the right response. It's just chronic infection does not really assist with an optimal health, like in the same way, like feeding these microbial overgrowths and infections in the intestines is not going to be supportive of optimal health. So of course, those things are going to cause excessive acute phase responses to the point where they become chronic. And that's not going to be a good thing in the same way that they're not great in the acute situation either. But yeah, it's just, again, it's just the mechanism that we're seeing this happen. It's not the problem. It's not the cause. And that's what you were getting at with the essentially the same situation in heart disease, right? Yeah. Yeah. So the last piece here is that is the polyunsaturated fats. And you mentioned those real quickly, but when it comes to these problems with fructose and seeing the pathways that it activates, the inflammatory pathways, one of them that Robert Lustig points out is the JNK pathway, which is just an inflammation response. And the fat production that comes with it, when there's a really great study where they blocked one of the downstream metabolites of omega-6s, a polyunsaturated fat. And when they did that, the fructose that was originally causing this fatty liver and fat production didn't do it at all. They couldn't, no matter how much fructose they were giving, the fructose was not being converted to fat. And so again, this is just another huge factor where, of course, every single rat is fed a lot of PUFA. So you're going to see the situation in any study with fructose, whether it is mediated by endotoxin or not, or it's just a feature of rat liver versus human livers, you're always going to have this confounding variable of PUFA in there. And that's going to encourage the conversion from fructose to fat instead of all of the other places that it can be used for. And part of the way that it does that is through amplifying these inflammation signals, for example, maybe in response to endotoxin. That's one of the main things that the prostaglandins do, which are downstream metabolites of omega-6s. And that's like part of their main effect is amplifying that inflammation response. So, and not in a necessary way. This isn't one of those things like you're discussing with the acute phase response where you need that amplification in order to respond to this. That's more of a just feature of the input in the environment of having a lot of PUFA that's telling us that we need to encourage that inflamed state even further because we are being bogged down by the polyunsaturated fats.
Yeah. And the other thing with PUFA too is that in order to move from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is an actual inflammation, it requires oxidative stress in the liver. And that oxidative stress, am I going too far?
It's fine. I mean, we'll dig into it more. I mean, you can, it's a little sneak peek, but we'll talk about that more when we're actually talking about like what is causing fatty liver. Yeah. Because it is, PUFA is a big factor there.
The PUFA there is essentially converts it because it allows for increased oxidative stress. And we can go into the mechanisms a little bit later on. But yeah, it's like that is a huge factor in this situation. And it's not like people say it's protective. And I guess we'll get into that too, where they, it's protective because it's an unsaturated fat and it's going to lower lipid fats and yada, yada, yada. But like, not necessarily. And it really we'll get into it. So I would definitely argue I don't want to jump the gun
helping,
here.
But because I want to continue this whole fructose situation and just kind of put that to rest as far as this idea that fructose is going to be causing fatty liver. So we talked through some of those main misconceptions and what's some of the problems with the research. And now I want to dig into what's actually happening instead of that, especially in humans, especially maybe relatively healthy or even some just average humans. What is happening with fructose and what is the evidence that we're seeing that it's not really going to cause fatty liver? And so as we mentioned before, there's a few different pathways that the fructose can go through. And this is in the liver. For one, it'll be converted to energy. It'll be oxidized through the mitochondria used to produce ATP and CO2 so that the liver can function. And as I mentioned, that's a huge pathway because the liver requires a huge amount of energy, almost as much as our brains. And that's because it has so many functions as far as detoxification goes. And, and it detoxifies endotoxin is one of those things. And that's one of the main insults we have to deal with. So that's a huge piece. Another thing, or one of the other places it can be converted to is glycogen, where it'll be converted to glycogen and stored in the liver. And our livers can store a pretty decent amount of glycogen, about 100 grams or so, depending on the situation. It can vary, but around that amount. And then it can also be converted to glucose or lactate and then exported to the rest of the body, to the rest of the tissues, and used for fuel. And we talked about some of the problems with lactate production in the CO2 series, but that's not the same as this conversion to lactate and then that lactate being used as a fuel elsewhere. As far as like if we take a muscle cell that's getting either glucose or lactate, if it's getting lactate, that's only one step away from being converted to pyruvate and then to acetyl-CoA. So it's very close to just jumping right into the Krebs cycle. It doesn't actually require all the enzymatic processes that glycolysis that are involved in glycolysis from glucose. So as a fuel, it's actually totally fine and a pretty efficient one. The problem is rather when you end up producing a lot of lactate in, for example, a muscle cell, that's a sign of derangement. It's a sign that things are not, or in any cell really, it's a sign that things are not being able to be converted farther down. So just to clarify that, this conversion to lactate and distribution is not really a problem. It's not the same as producing excessive amounts. Yeah. Well, I still don't see it as a problem. The conversion.
Well, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying it's like if the muscle cell is producing lactate, it's because it's not doing oxidative phosphorylation. It's not oxidizing to CO2, ATP, and water, or creating that in the process. It's just going it's moving the substrate through lactate, whereas the liver is putting out lactate. It's a little different.
Yeah. And there are studies showing where they like inject lactate or are given lactate as a substrate, and that doesn't really cause much in the way of issues. So tends to be used pretty well. So that's some of the main effects of or main pathways for fructose, but in particular people. Well, and then the last one too, of course, is it can be used to be converted into fat, and people will always say that that's the main route that it goes. And we talked about endotoxin and PUFA being major confounding factors there. But I wanted to go through a couple of studies just showing how well fructose is used and how well it's stored. So there's one study where they were giving either a 30-gram dose or a 60-gram dose of fructose. And this was in people who are on the lower side as far as weight goes. The average was about 130 pounds. And between those two situations, the 30 grams and the 60 grams, there's no change in triglyceride production, fat production. And the same percentage was oxidized. So between 55 and 60% of that fructose was oxidized, which is it's pretty noteworthy for two reasons. One, if we're concerned about capacity for fructose, you would expect to see that there's a limit, right? That in this case, going from 30 to 60 grams, which is a very large dose, you would expect
in one sitting. Yeah.
Yeah. And you would expect there to be a major difference in fat production. You would expect that, in the 30-gram dose, maybe 60% is oxidized, but in the 60-gram dose, maybe only, 30% or 40% is oxidized because you can't oxidize all the extra fructose. You can't handle it. And that's kind of the idea, but that's not at all what they were seeing here. Where instead they were able to handle that fructose perfectly well, and it didn't increase triglycerides significantly between those two doses, whether it was 30 grams or 60 grams. So that's a pretty noteworthy one. Did you have anything to add in there?
No, go ahead.
Okay. And another one, this one they were doing, and also for reference too, like 30 grams of fructose, normally we're getting that in the form of sugar, that is glucose as well. So that would be like the equivalent of a soda and a half of if the soda was with cane sugar. Like that's the amount of fructose that, like there would be 30 grams of fructose in like a soda and a half. And then for the 60 grams, it would be like 3 sodas worth of fructose. And
in one sitting at one time.
Yeah. So it's a pretty big dose. We're not talking small doses here. In this next study, they doubled the carbohydrates. So these people went from having 324 grams of carbs a day to 648. And they also increased their fat. So they went from having 117 grams of fat today to 148 grams of fat a day. And they did this for 5 days. And during this time, their calories skyrocketed as well, of course. So they went from 2,723 calories a day to 4,550 calories a day. So we're just seeing basically huge overfeeding, most of it coming from carbs and some amount coming from fat. And these were not athletes. These were average people. Their average weight was 165 pounds. And when they were consuming when they were overfeeding, they were eating the almost 700 grams of carbs per day and the almost 150 grams of fat per day. They were only producing 5 grams of fat from the fructose. The amount of de novo lipogenesis in the liver was only 5 grams per day. And that's not nothing. I mean, it's not like you don't want to have that much, but I mean, 5 grams is like nothing compared to the amount that was taken in. And you're only looking at it at that time. Obviously, it seems like in these people, first off, they almost double. I mean, their calories went up by 1,800. So this is not something that would have been sustainable for them, but that they would have continued doing. And as soon as you go back down, you'd probably just oxidize, those few extra grams of fat that you had produced in the liver. So, I mean, that's huge. I mean, if the whole idea here is that all of this extra fructose that would be in the carbohydrates that you're consuming is going to increase fatty liver, then, I mean, it's just not at all what you're seeing in these studies. And then there's another one that was just looking at a review, and they had reported that about 1 to 5% of the fructose that's consumed gets converted to triglycerides through de novo lipogenesis. Yeah. Yeah. And they also pointed out that this amount of fat, like the 5 grams in the last one, tends to be only around 1% of the total amount of fat that you would typically consume in your diet. So yes, you're producing the small amount of fat from fructose, but the liver also picks up fatty acids. Like when you're eating fat, they can also be picked up by the liver, and they are picked up by the liver. And so if you're eating 100 grams of fat and producing 2 grams from fructose, like what is really is that really a concern? Is that really a problem? And how different is that from just picking up some fat that you were taking up? And what we're trying to get at here, or at least one of the things, is that A, we use fructose really well. It's not as simple as just eating fructose causes fatty liver. And B, it's the processes that are leading to the fat production that we'll talk about that are really where we want to be focused on. Because when those when our metabolism is deranged, it increases those things. And then we end up storing a lot more of the food that we're taking in, whether it's fats or carbs, and whether it's glucose or fructose. We'll end up storing a lot more of that as fat when these things are deranged.
So I just want to put something into perspective here. So there's 453 grams in a pound, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Or 450. So
something right around
454. Yeah. So it would take 90 days producing 5 grams of fat from your liver per day to increase fat by 1 pound. And that's just like anybody who wants to go into like basic calories in, calories out, or like a macros in, macros out type of deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't find any of the explanations that people like to talk about for calories in, calories out, and like some of these bioenergetic explanations like very feasible, unless you start talking about modifiers like endotoxin on the liver, or some type of metabolic derangement, or like a hormonal situation, which we'll actually get into as well in this podcast. And the one thing I want to point out is, like, for someone like you or I, right? Like, we're both around 190, 200 pounds, and like 6'2". So just to maintain our body mass at rest on a basic caloric calculation, it comes out to be around 2,000, 2,100 calories a day. That's to do absolutely nothing. That's to just lay down, right, all day long. So if I work out X number of times a week and I walk around and I do whatever I do, right, like I go for a walk every day, that number based on those things can jump to about 3,000 to 3,500 calories in a day, depending on how many days a week I work out and what my other activity levels are. Like, one of the things that kind of annoys me with all this stuff is, like, to meet 3,500 calories in a day, like the amount of fat, because and this is in consideration of protein, right? There's only so much protein you can eat. There's only so much protein you want to eat. And going into like 300, 400 grams of protein a day to meet your caloric intake just isn't feasible. Financially and like physically. It doesn't make any sense to do anything like that. And that's especially if you're going to be doing it with whole foods. If you're going to be mainlining protein powder into the vein, that's a different story. But I mean, none of us are recommending that. So it's like you have to make up that difference with carbs and fat. Those are going to be the bulk caloric content of the diet. And the thing that frustrates me is, in a lot of these studies, or a lot of people talking about fatty liver or this and that, like, they discuss things from the perspective of, oh, like, you can't have fat and you can't have carbs together, or you can't have, like, you can only have like polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat, and then you also, like, you can only have starch. It's like, you know how difficult it is to eat 300 or 400 grams of carbs from starch a day to meet your caloric intake, especially if that's from, like, if you're like, oh, I'm going to use sweet potatoes or potatoes. It's like, it's impossible. You're so full from that. And then the other thing to put in context there is, like, there's no way that you can safely consume all of your fat from, I'll get to this in a second why I'm talking about this, but you can safely consume your fat from polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat. You couldn't do it, because you would just, like, the only fat source that you could do it with would probably be macadamia nuts or macadamia nut oil. If you tried to do it with another type of oil, your omega-6 content would be so high, it would just be a terrible strategy from a dietary perspective, from an inflammatory perspective. The reason I'm getting at this is because, like, people's concept of things like, oh, you have to eat less than X number of grams of fructose a day, and you have to eat you can't have saturated fat, which is something that people say causes fatty liver. And so it's like, you severely limit what people can eat in a lot of these states, and then basically it's just like the solution, oh, you have to starve yourself, you have to eat, like, you have to severely undereat, and then you have to exercise more and stuff like that, and then it automatically goes to this gluttony thing. But it doesn't make sense in any of the context when you can look at somebody's body mass size, and then how much they should be eating based on their activity level, according to like a generic calculator, which just gives you a baseline. It just doesn't pan out. It's just not, like, the recommendations aren't possible to manage in like a sustainable and healthy way, right? I remember when we tried to eat 400 grams of starch. I remember trying to do it with plantains and being like, I don't think I even absorbed it. I think most of it went out the other end, just because it's so much bulk. The digestive system just couldn't handle it. So, and then as far as like meeting it with polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fat, The only safe, mostly monounsaturated fat source is macadamia nut oil or macadamia nuts. And so like that doesn't seem feasible to me as like this is going to be the solution to solve these problems. You can only have 25 grams of fructose a day, which basically cuts out almost all fruits, juice. And then you just okay, so you can only have starches, and it's like how much bread and potatoes and sweet potatoes can you eat in a day? And then it's like, so then you're left with to fill the bulk of the calories is going to be fats. And it's like, so it has to be monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. It's like how much omega-6 you can eat in a day. There's only so much fish oil that makes sense to eat, or even alpha linolenic acid from like this from these their alternative. We're mainstream from their alternative health perspective before you start drastically increasing oxidative stress and damage. So it's like you couldn't possibly make up the bulk of your calories from that. It just doesn't make any sense. Like I don't get what the strategy is from there. Like you're gonna have like 20, 30 grams of omega 3 in a day from alpha linolenic acid. Like that doesn't sound like a good idea. Like I don't see any studies supporting that as a beneficial strategy for for health. Like you're gonna upregulate oxidative stress drastically with that. Just like that's that's what the point I'm trying to get at is like the opposite recommendations of the things that we're talking about, like just based on looking like, oh, fructose causes fatty liver, so just limit fructose to X number of grams a day. Like even in a dietary context, it like doesn't make any sense. And then like them talking about de novo lipogenesis, oh, it increases it 5 grams over the course of a week. It's like, okay, so how is this causing obesity? The fructose by itself causing obesity if it would take 90 days to gain 1 pound of fat. Like when you have an obese child, you think that he put on or she put on all those pounds of fat in their 5 years of life based on that equation right there by itself? Like that doesn't make any sense. Right? That's kind of what. Go ahead.
Yeah. So a couple things, just real quick on that last point. The de novo lipogenesis, we're just talking about in the liver. So in some of the study, I mean, the next study we'll talk about, especially, they did find that de novo lipogenesis could occur in the liver if you're eating like huge amounts of carbohydrates, and that could contribute to body fat. But the other thing is you can have fat production in the fat cells even when you're not producing fat in the liver. Yeah. So, but that aside, it sounds like what you're getting at. So like the mainstream view is fructose is bad and causes fatty liver, and saturated fat is bad and causes fatty liver. And so what you're kind of getting at is like, even and from the mainstream, they suggest having a decent amount of carbs, right? So it's like, what even does that diet look like? And as you said, it basically just requires a ton of grains and vegetable oils. That's like, if you're getting some amount of fat, it has to be all unsaturated. So you're getting a bunch of vegetable oils. And from the carb side, you're getting a bunch of grains because that won't have much fructose. And that is typically what those recommendations are. But, the other thing too, so obviously I don't think there's most people, I think, who are listening to this, or most people who are talking about fatty liver outside of the mainstream, are either saying it's fructose or carbohydrates in general, or it's saturated fat, and you've got like the anti-saturated fat people, maybe more on the vegetarian vegan side. And then on the other side, you've got maybe the lower carbers, right, who are suggesting that fructose is this metabolic poison. Yep. And obviously, like a low carb diet, you can get a lot of calories from a low carb, high fat diet, and vice versa. You can get a decent amount of calories from a low fat, high carb diet. So I don't like, it's worth pointing out that like this mainstream view just leads to basically you have to have like a grain and vegetable oil diet, which I don't know it doesn't sound like reasonable at all to us. It sounds pretty insane, but to people, from who are following the food pyramid or my plate or whatever, maybe that's not so absurd. But yeah, and so I want to continue discussing like why this idea that fructose is the problem is not the case. But as you mentioned, it's also worth discussing a little bit of why consuming fat is not the problem either. And so we'll get to that right after.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it in context because like people want to break it down into calories in, calories out, and like talk about bioenergetics from that sense, and then not consider the other areas and then make recommendations off of that. And like even with the 5-year-old, even with fat production occurring in fat cells, like can bioenergetics alone explain that based on the amount of calories they're going to eat in a day? Like could they severely eat that much calories to make themselves obese at like 5 years old? Like my point is that there has to be some modifying factor going on besides just, oh, they ate too much fructose, or oh, they ate too much, they ate too many burgers, too much saturated fat. Like there's something else more going on in a lot of these situations, I think. And
definitely,
yeah, I want to point that out with the fructose, and the fructose stuff makes me think of that, because like they put these harsh recommendation on fructose, but like even their own explanations don't make sense around it, right? Like it doesn't, it's not like adding up in that model. And that's why we're talking, that's the whole point, is that it doesn't add up within the model that they want to, like out of one side of their mouth, they're explaining things as calories in, calories out. And then on the other side of their mouth, they want to like harp, oh, it's fructose. And then like their equations don't necessarily follow with the calories in, calories out model. Like it's the modifier that they're talking about there, that from the mainstream, or their mainstream point of view, I would say.
So you're kind of saying, what you're saying is that the idea that fructose is a problem directly conflicts with the idea that it's just about calories. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, like there maybe not directly, but to some extent, like there's conflict there. If you were to break it down, is like, that's like you can't hold both at the same time. Like you have to start. It makes you start to think that there's something else going on.
Yeah, and I don't know how many. I mean, a lot of times when you hear the calories in, calories out, which by the way, I do not consider that to be bioenergetics, at least not the way that we describe it. I mean, that is sometimes referred to as energy balance or bioenergetics, and that's not what we refer to when we talk about those things, because calories and energy are not equivalent. We've talked about that in previous episodes, so I'll link to those. But you had just mentioned bioenergetics, so I wanted to clarify that's not what
the only
mean.
thing I could think of, because that's what they call it. Like every textbook you first get, it goes through the cell, and then there's a chapter on bioenergetics talking about anabolism and catabolism and breaking it down in the concept of calories. And so, and that's where I'm getting it from.
Yeah, I call it calorie balance or something, because it's I consider that to be more accurate. I mean, either way, though, it's like a nonsensical concept, and we discussed that before. But I don't know. I mean, a lot of times the calories in, calories out is used as a reference for body fat gain. I don't normally see that as I don't normally see people saying that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the mainstream is caused by too many calories. So I don't want to be like, conflating things there, or like creating a straw man.
The solution that people tend to like, the solutions that I've seen offered in the mainstream for the fatty liver is like, you need to go in a caloric deficit. Like that's the automatic response. And it's like, okay, sure. But it's like that, like while it roundabout may solve the issue, like it doesn't get to the core of the problem. And that's why I guess like this is why I'm getting at that, is because like the solution is automatically, intermittent fasting, and or like you need to only protein, and you have to have a low carb diet, and then you also have to have like a lower, like a non-saturated fat diet to solve the fatty liver situation. Like I've seen that recommend. I guess I went 10 steps ahead again, but to see the recommendation there with people, I see that very, very often. It's like no fructose. You have to have a higher protein diet, and then you also you can't have saturated fats, and you can't eat too many carbs. And it's just like, so what do you eat? Like it's a low fat, low carb, high protein diet. And it's like, it basically like, okay, we need to go into starvation. Like those are the recommendations that I kind of see. It needs to be caloric restricted. And then maybe you can do like give yourself an eating window so it's not as hard. Like I've seen that recommendation like in quite a few places for solving the fatty liver situation. And I know with your clients, that's not what you're doing. And I know that.
No, of course. Yeah.
But that's not the recommendation I've made for other people, and have seen changes without having to starve them.
Yeah. I guess I'm more familiar with people saying like fructose is causing fatty liver or saturated fat, not as much just going calorie deficit and high protein, low carb, low fat diet. But that is, we talked about that before. That is like the very mainstream idea. Like everything is bad except protein and vegetables. So that's what your diet should be.
Yeah.
Although animal protein's bad. So it's like just vegetables and vegetable proteins that are, some highly processed vegetable protein so you can get that.
Well, that's like the plant-based stuff. It's like your diet's beans and grains, and like that's going to be your health food for you. And it's just like, if you've ever just eaten beans and grain, like I don't know how sustainable that is. That's what I'm getting at. Like it's just, it doesn't make sense in a large overall picture that's being described. Like, I don't know, maybe I jumped too many steps ahead. But
yeah,
I don't mean to derail us entirely. So
that's okay.
Yeah, let's go back to fructose and continue from there.
Yeah. So the next thing I did want to talk about, so we talked about how well fructose gets used. It gets oxidized really well. we really don't produce much fat in our livers, even when we're having a lot of fructose. And then the other thing too is just how well we store it, which is just really, it's a lot more than people would expect. So there's this carbohydrate overfeeding study. I've referenced it once before, where it was with athletes. They glycogen depleted them by putting them on a lower carb diet and doing some workouts. And then they gave them between 750 and 1,000 grams of carbs per day. And what they found was that during this time, the athletes initially they were oxidizing about 400 grams of carbs, and it then, like at the beginning of this carbohydrate overfeeding, and then it increased to as much as 1,000 grams of carbs per day that were being oxidized. So that means that you are burning over 2 pounds, because 1,000 grams is a kilogram, which is like 2.2 pounds. So that means that these athletes were burning as fuel over 2 pounds of carbohydrates, which is insane. That's like a huge amount. And just and at some points too, it's worth mentioning that they were adapting in a way that they were burning more carbs at some points than the amount they were taking in. So they might have only been taking in 800 grams at the time, yet at some points they were burning more than that, which just shows our immense capacity for handling carbohydrates. So that's worth mentioning. Another thing too is that they found that de novo lipid synthesis, de novo lipogenesis, as a contributor to body fat production, didn't happen until the glycogen stores had at least 500 grams of carbohydrates. And they found that even after that point, there was more glycogen that was stored, up to around 800 to 1,000 grams of carbs stored as glycogen throughout the body, in the liver and in the muscles, which is also it's just pretty profound to see how much carbohydrate we can store. And that means that that's like carbohydrate above what you're using. So whatever's left over, we have an incredible capacity to store carbohydrate, and we really don't start converting much of it to fat if we're healthy until those stores are pretty well saturated, and we're really forcing a lot of overfeeding. Not to say that these people's diets were perfect anyway either, but and again, we've talked about this in the past, why overfeeding is really not a concern, in this regard, because when we're producing energy and using the food that we're taking in, well, it naturally turns off our hunger signals. That's the whole point of hunger in the first place. So way before this point, in someone who's metabolically healthy and eating a lot of food, they would not be continually hungry to the point where they could even eat that much. All right, before we wrap up this episode, I did just want to add in, as far as that carbohydrate overfeeding study that I just mentioned, where the participants were burning as much as 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per day, that's equal to 4,000 calories per day, and that's just carbohydrates. It's not considering any fat or protein that's being oxidized or used anywhere else. So just to add some scale to what that really means to be burning 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per day. And in part 2 of this series, we'll be discussing how fatty liver is really caused by a failure of energy production, and we'll be digging into the research and mechanisms underlying this concept. And if you did enjoy today's episode, please leave a like or comment if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening elsewhere, please leave a review or a 5-star rating. All of those things really do a lot to help support the podcast and are very much appreciated. To check out the show notes for today's episode, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at the studies and articles and anything else that we referenced throughout today's episode. And as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, this series was inspired by listener questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer on a future episode, please send those in to jay@jfeldmanwellness.com. That's jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. And if you are dealing with any of these symptoms that we described today, maybe you're dealing with fatty liver disease or insulin resistance or any related conditions like diabetes or heart disease, or if you're dealing with any other symptoms or chronic health issues like chronic cravings and hunger, low energy or fatigue, chronic pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms like bloating or slow motility, or brain fog or insomnia, or any hormonal imbalances, or if you're dealing with any other chronic health issues, maybe something like an autoimmune issue or one of those chronic health conditions I mentioned earlier, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for a free energy balance mini course, where I'll explain how these different symptoms and conditions are really caused by a lack of energy, and I'll also walk you through the main things that you can do by adjusting your diet and lifestyle to maximize your cellular energy and therefore resolve these symptoms and conditions. So to sign up for that free energy balance mini course, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy. And with that, I'll see you in the next episode.